The law of the riverbank. The river changed its voice 3 hours before dawn, and Freya Ashgrove was already awake to hear it. In the 6 weeks since the flood had driven her out of her valley, she had trained herself to sleep with one ear turned toward moving water. So when the sound outside the ruined mill shifted pitch, a groan that didn't belong to wind or rain, she was on her feet before her mind had caught up with her body. She was nobody here. That was the plain truth of her situation, and she had stopped dressing it up in kinder language weeks ago. A refugee from a drowned valley, carrying a waterlogged pack and the clothes on her back, standing at the edge of a kingdom that had never heard her name and had no reason to learn it. She'd walked 3 days to reach the edges of Hallam's territory because it was the nearest high ground left standing in a week's travel any direction. She'd spent 2 nights in the burned-out shell of a mill because it still had 4 walls and half a roof, and because no one had come to tell her she couldn't. Her valley had gone under in a single night. The river had risen faster than anyone living could account for, and she had spent the week since picking her way from one temporary shelter to the next, always climbing, always aware of exactly how little stood between her and something far worse. She had buried what the flood let her bury and carried what little else remained. And somewhere in that process, she had become a person who expected to be overlooked, and had made an uneasy peace with the expectation. It wasn't bitterness. It was closer to bookkeeping. No house left standing. No family near enough to call on. No name that carried weight in any hall she might wander into. She had grown accustomed to being invisible in rooms full of people with somewhere warmer to be. She did not expect to find a king in the water. The mill sat above a bend in the river, just below the old stone bridge. It was the bridge's voice she'd heard, timber and stone giving way in a manner no storm she'd ever weathered could explain. She reached the bank in time to watch the far span buckle and drop, and in the last gray scrap of light before the current swallowed it, she saw a rider thrown clear of his horse and pulled under. She didn't stop to consider who he was. She didn't think about the cold, or the fact that she hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days, or the broken timber traveling fast enough in that current to break bone. She went in because a person was drowning 20 feet from where she stood, and no one else was close enough to reach him before the river finished what it had started. The water took her breath the instant it closed over her shoulders. A cold so total it stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like a hand closing around her ribs. She kicked toward the place she'd last seen him vanish. Missed. Surfaced. Forced her limbs to keep moving instead of locking up the way every instinct screamed at her to do. On the second attempt, her fingers found fabric. A sleeve, an arm, a shoulder far too wide and far too heavy to be lifted by any ordinary measure. He was face down against a fallen timber gate, one arm trapped beneath the wreckage, motionless except for the current dragging at what remained of him. She got a hand under his collar and pulled. Nothing gave. She braced her boots against the submerged stone, found no footing, tried again. On the third pull, the timber shifted half an inch, enough to feel it give. On the fourth, drawing on whatever strength 3 days of walking and 2 nights of near starvation had left her, she tore him loose. They went backward into the shallows together, coughing river water onto the frozen bank, his weight pinning her legs until she managed to work herself free. That was when she saw his eyes. Gold, then human, then gold again. Flickering the way a candle flickers when something is fighting to stay lit. When the wick has nearly drowned and the flame hasn't decided, moment to moment, whether it means to survive. She didn't understand what she was looking at. She only understood that his ribs were rising and falling too shallowly beneath her palms, and that a dark stain was spreading through torn linen at his side that had nothing to do with the river. She pressed her hands against the wound because it was the only thing she knew how to do, and she stayed there, soaked, shaking, dragging him another 20 feet clear of the rising water, an inch at a time, until the sound of horses reached her before the riders did. The first man to arrive was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, moving with the flat, practiced urgency of a soldier who had drilled for exactly this and hoped never to need it. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, closing the distance at a run, and then he stopped dead. Not at the sight of his king, at the sight of her hand still pressed against him. Move away from him! It wasn't a request. His voice carried the particular stillness of a man holding something enormous very carefully. She moved. Of course she moved. 6 weeks of being no one in particular had taught her exactly how much space the world allotted someone like her, and it was never more than she was given permission to occupy in that instant. What she hadn't expected was the silence that followed. Not relief at finding their king alive, not gratitude toward the stranger who'd pulled him out. Silence. Heavy, strange, spreading through 3 more riders as they arrived and went equally still. Then the first man's voice again, quieter now, almost to himself, as if testing whether the words could survive being spoken aloud. No one has touched him like that in 289 years. She didn't understand the number. It sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed without meaning to, foreign and unexplained, while the men lifted their king with a care that bordered on reverence, refusing every offer she made to help carry him, and left her alone on the riverbank as dawn came up gray and indifferent behind her. She expected to be left there entirely. She wasn't. A fifth rider, younger than the others, was sent back for her, wearing the expression of a man who'd drawn the short assignment and resented it only slightly less than he feared refusing it. The castle, when the mist finally parted around it, was larger than anything she'd stood inside since the valley took her home. Gray stone walls rose 3 stories above a courtyard churning with servants, dogs, and the particular controlled chaos of a household absorbing a catastrophe. No one looked at her directly. Several people looked at her very carefully while pretending not to. She was given dry clothes, plain, ill-fitting, chosen for function rather than comfort, a small fire in a small stone room, and a locked door with a guard posted outside it. She understood immediately that this wasn't protection, it was containment. She sat with that fire for the better part of a day before anyone came to speak to her, turning the strange number over and over, unable to make it mean anything sensible. 289 years was longer than any kingdom she'd ever heard of standing unbroken under a single house. Longer, she suspected, than these very stones had been mortared together. When someone finally came, it was the same gray-templed soldier from the riverbank, standing in the doorway with his arms folded and an expression she couldn't fully read. "Gareth Kell," he said, "first beta to King Rurik Halcom." He said it the way a man states his rank to someone he hasn't yet decided whether to trust. "You should hear what you've done for me, before someone else tells it to you wrong." She said nothing, because she'd learned that silence usually costs less than questions. He told her anyway. The pack held a law older than the castle's foundations, older than any treaty inked in any hall she'd passed through that morning. No hand but a bonded mate's was permitted to touch the Alpha King during a moment of true vulnerability. Not during illness, not during injury, not in the aftermath of battle when even kings bled like any other wounded man. The law existed because vulnerability, for an Alpha King, was never merely physical. It was a door left open, and a wolf-blooded court had learned, centuries before any of them were born, exactly what could walk through an open door if the wrong hands were the ones holding it that way. A wolf caught mid-shift, half-drowned and unable to defend himself, could be finished by a blade no larger than a sewing needle, if the person holding him chose to use it that way instead of pulling him to safety. Not once in 289 years had that law been broken. Not because the opportunity had never come. Kings were injured. Kings grew ill. Kings occasionally drowned in rivers when bridges failed beneath them. But because no one had ever been present and desperate enough and untrained enough in the customs of the court, at the single moment it might have mattered. Every servant, every soldier, every noble raised within a day's ride of the castle knew the law the way they knew not to reach into fire. They would have stood on that bank and watched their king drown before they'd have broken it, and every one of them would have called that restraint loyalty rather than cowardice. Freya had broken it without knowing it existed, because she had grown up 3 days' walk from anyone who might have taught her better. "I didn't know," she said when he finished. It was the first thing she'd said to him since the riverbank. "I'm aware," Gareth said. "That's the only reason you're behind a locked door and not somewhere considerably worse." He didn't elaborate on what worse might look like, and she didn't ask. He studied her a long moment. the way a soldier studies a stretch of ground he hasn't yet decided is safe to cross. For what it's worth, he added, before he turned to go, he'd have been dead inside another few minutes. I've watched enough men drown to know the difference. Whatever else comes of this, you should know that much plainly. It was 3 days before anyone told her the king had survived at all beyond that single grudging admission. The wound along his ribs had run deep, and the cold had done enough damage on top of it that the household's healers had spent 2 nights uncertain which way the balance would tip. She learned this in fragments from the young guard who brought her meals, the only person in the castle willing to speak to her as though she were a person and not a category no one had a name for. His name was Osen. He couldn't have been more than 17, newly assigned to castle duty, and still visibly unlearning the instinct to treat every stranger with the same wary formality the rest of the household extended to her. They don't know what to do with you, he admitted on the second evening, setting down a tray of bread and broth clearly larger than her allotted ration. There isn't a rule for what you did, only a rule that says it shouldn't have been possible. Nobody ever wrote down what happens after, because nobody thought after would come. That sounds like a very convenient law, Freya said, for people who never have to be the one drowning. Osen didn't have an answer for that. He didn't argue with it either, and he left the door cracked open a while longer than strictly necessary before the guard outside noticed and made him close it. It was Osen who told her, on the 4th day, why the flood had put the Alpha King into the river in the first place. The bridge hadn't simply failed to a bad storm, the way bridges sometimes did in a hard season. Its support timbers had been quietly weakened months in advance, compromised in a way that wouldn't show until exactly the wrong combination of weight and water brought it down. And someone inside the king's own court had known, with unsettling precision, exactly when he would cross it. She absorbed that the way she'd absorbed most things since the flood took her valley, carefully, without trusting it fully, and without any illusion that knowing it improved her situation. On the 5th day, her door opened without a guard's knock ahead of it, and a woman stepped through whose beauty was so immediate, so exactingly arranged, that Freya understood, before a word was spoken, she was in the presence of someone important. Every fold of the woman's gown, every pearl worked into her hair, seemed chosen with an audience in mind, and Freya had the distinct sensation of being appraised in the half-second before the woman's expression settled into warmth. "Lady Ismay Fenmore," the woman said, and her smile carried the glow of firelight and the precision of a diplomat who had never once said anything by accident. She was, by every account Freya had gathered in whispered fragments from Osen and from servants who hadn't realized she was listening, the most celebrated woman in Halam's court, beloved by the nobility, adored by the common households, credited with a decade of quiet political architecture that had kept the kingdom's fractious houses from tearing one another apart during the Alpha King's father's difficult final years. She had held the court together through 2 succession disputes and a famine, and had done it with a gentleness that made her nearly impossible to resent, which Freya suspected was precisely the design of the gentleness. "You must be exhausted," Lady Fenmore said, seating herself in the room's only chair without waiting to be asked, leaving Freya standing. "And frightened, I should think. It's an enormous thing, what happened to you. No one could have prepared you for it." "I'm managing," Freya said. "Of course you are. Anyone capable of what you did on that riverbank is managing a great deal more than most people twice your age." The compliment landed with the same practiced warmth as everything else about her. "I want you to know that no one blames you for what you did. You couldn't have known the law. It would be monstrous to punish an act of genuine courage simply because you weren't raised close enough to the castle to be taught its customs." A pause timed precisely long enough to let the reasonableness of it settle. "Which is exactly why I think the kindest thing, for everyone, but especially for you, would be to arrange your quiet return to the refugee settlements within the week, before the court decides it wants something more complicated from you than gratitude. Courts are cruel to people they don't have a category for, my dear. I would rather see you safely away before that cruelty finds its shape." Freya understood, even before Lady Fenmore finished speaking, that she was being handed a choice dressed up as kindness, and that the alternative to accepting it had gone unstated, implied with the same careful precision as everything else the woman said. I'll consider it, Freya said, which was not agreement. Lady Fenmore's smile suggested she heard the difference clearly and chose for now not to press it. Of course, she said, rising. Take all the time you need to consider it. I only ask that you consider it quickly. She paused at the threshold, and for just a moment before she stepped through it, something in her expression cooled by several degrees. Not anger exactly, but the flatter recalculation of someone whose plans had met an unexpected variable. Then it was gone, replaced by warmth, and she was gone with it. It was after that visit, alone with the fire burning low, that Freya finally opened the pack she'd carried out of the valley and hadn't properly gone through since the flood. Half buried in mud-stiffened cloth, wedged against the frame, in a way that suggested it had come loose from something else during the crossing, rather than having been packed there on purpose, sat an iron-bound ledger, its lock still sealed with a wax stamp she didn't recognize. She had no memory of taking it. She could only assume it had washed against her in the water alongside the king, and that some instinct honed by hard practice, never trust anything that looks abandoned in moving water, had made her shove it into her pack without thinking. No. She turned it over in her hands for a long while before she worked up the nerve to ask about it. When she finally did, framing the question to Osin as idle curiosity about an old book she'd found, the answer came back faster and stranger than she'd expected. The castle's archivist wanted to see it immediately. Maester Cowan was an elderly man with thinning white hair and ink-stained fingers, and he went pale the moment the ledger was set on his table, and he saw the seal. "This belongs to the bridge inspector's office," he said, hands not quite steady as he turned it beneath the candlelight. "It was reported destroyed in a fire 11 years ago. Officially, it doesn't exist. I helped file that report myself on the word of the man who told me it had burned." He read late into that night and later into two more, refusing after the first hour to send her from the room, muttering half to himself and half to her as he cross-referenced names against a shelf of older records he seemed to know by heart. What the ledger told him, told both of them, was a plain, careful account written in a bridge inspector's meticulous hand of 3 separate warnings filed across 4 years about the failing supports on the very crossing that had put the Alpha King into the river. Each warning had been formally received. Each had been quietly set aside, filed under a heading that suggested routine maintenance rather than structural failure. Each bore, in the margin, the same counter-signature, a court official named Master Hale, who had in recent months been observed courting Lady Isma Fenmore's favor with unusual persistence in what several servants had assumed was simple ambition, and no one had thought to question further. "She didn't drown him herself," Maester Cowan said quietly on the third night, staring at the pages spread across the table, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead where he'd forgotten them. "She didn't have to. She only had to make certain the bridge would fail exactly once, at exactly the wrong moment, and let the river do the rest. No blade, no poison, no hand anyone could ever trace back to her own. It is, I'll grant her, an extraordinarily patient piece of architecture." Freya thought of the 289 years, of a law built to keep the wrong hands away from a king at his most vulnerable, and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with the fire in the room that the law had never anticipated a threat that arrived as water instead of a person. 289 years spent guarding against hands, and no one had thought to guard against a bridge. King Rurik found her in the archive on the evening of the 6th day, still favoring the ribs she had helped save, moving more carefully than a man his size and bearing should ever need to. He found her exactly where his archivist had left her hours before, hunched over ledger pages by candlelight, matching names to dates with the same stubborn, unglamorous focus she'd used to drag him out of a river. He didn't thank her, not in words, not yet. He crossed the room without asking permission, the way a man moves through his own house, and sat across the table from her, and for a long while he simply watched her work in silence, his eyes steady now, human, not flickering the way they had on the riverbank, following her hands as she turned pages.